I need to preface today's episode by saying it's very different from my usual content. It's strictly political. Before you accuse me of partisanship, be aware that I'm disgusted with both major political parties. The way both Democrats and Republicans have handled the coronavirus crisis and governing in general has been incredibly damaging. If this type of content doesn't interest you, feel free not to watch. I'll probably be back to my usual content next week. But if you're an American of working age, please consider watching this video. It might be the most important one I ever make. Thank you.
And again, when you have 15 people, and the 15 within a couple of days is going to be down to close to zero, that's a pretty good job we've done.
Today, financial markets suffered historic losses. The Dow falling almost 3,000 points. That is the biggest one-day point drop of all time.
Concerns are growing about the health system's ability to handle the peak of the crisis, with beds filling up and critical supplies dwindling.
Imagine there's no heaven.
If you can't afford a payment because you've been laid off due to coronavirus, now is the time to start making phone calls.
4 U.S. senators, including Intelligence Committee Chair Richard Burr, reportedly sold stock before coronavirus fears sent the markets plunging.
Shortly after that tweet that I just noted, you sold over $1 million in stocks in your own personal portfolio before the market went down. Were you trading on inside information about what was coming?
He dumped his shares in hotel stocks so he wouldn't lose money, and then he stayed silent.
Now the pressure is really on to seal this deal and vote, with the hopes that all this money will help convince hard-hit businesses to keep their workers on.
There are 500,000 McDonald's workers just like me that have to go to work whether sick or well because we have no paid sick leave.
A letter just sent out by United CEO, president, and union leaders basically say they want a deal by the end of March, or payroll cuts will have to happen.
It seems like every day we learn about a new celebrity or a new professional athlete that got tested, and yet I can't get results on my patients. I've been swabbing people for about 1 week, and I still haven't gotten a result yet.
It is incomprehensible and unspeakable that corporations now are taking advantage of this crisis in order to get tax breaks and subsidies that have nothing to do with the coronavirus. And the Congress must be very clear. No tax breaks, no subsidies to these corporations.
– 118 years ago, a man who would go on to run for president from a prison cell said, "The cheapest commodity on earth today is human flesh and blood. To make a profit at the expense of human life is the central controlling motive of the capitalist system." Today, over a century later, that statement has never rung more true. Eugene V. Debs was a socialist, living in a time when America still had an active socialist party. And this line came from an impromptu speech at the Butte Auditorium in Montana, after being encouraged by local workers to say a few words. Debs went on to speak for over 2 hours. Having only planned to stop in Butte for the day, and with no intention of delivering a speech, the locals only received 3 hours' notice that Debs was going to speak. The auditorium was filled to capacity, with many latecomers content to stand. Debs spoke of the plight of the working class, the nature of class struggle between those who own the factories and those who operate them. He spoke of the value of human life and the security and dignity every American deserved as a right. He received a standing ovation. The problems of today are no different from the problems of Debs's time. They've persisted ever since. But as America seems to lurch towards a crisis point, all the wealth concentrated in the hands of a few as the masses lose their livelihoods in the face of a pandemic, we lack the understanding of 1902. Since that time, through conscious action by those in power, the language of class struggle has been repressed and forced out of the public conversation. We now live in a time of consensus. America is the greatest nation on earth. We've reached the end of history. Capitalism has been vindicated as the sole successful economic model. But deep down, most of us know that's not true. We don't feel successful. We're less well off than our parents. Most of us will never be able to buy a house or afford the cost of raising children. Other nations look at us with derision or pity. To understand this moment and how we got here, we need to understand the language of class struggle and acknowledge the fact that the system is rigged against those who actually do the work. Before we get to the heart of the matter, we need to set the stage. The average American life has changed dramatically in the past 30 or 40 years. In 1987, the average American could expect to be able to pay for the entirety of their 4-year college education on a minimum wage part-time salary. According to one study, the average combined cost of tuition, room, and board across 2,312 public and private universities in the U.S. was $39,643, adjusted for inflation. Let's do some math. All of these numbers will be adjusted for inflation. We'll take a fairly affordable school, say the University of Central Florida. The 4-year price for this particular school in 1987 was $33,100. The minimum wage in 1987 was $7.19. If a student worked 20 hours per week and put all of that money towards paying for their education, they could cover 106.5% of the cost and graduate with zero student debt. Fast forward to 2016 and the numbers look very different. The minimum wage is almost exactly the same, $7.25 versus $7.19. But over the 30 years, the cost of a 4-year degree from the University of Central Florida rose to $61,872. That's an increase of 87%. A student working 20 hours per week at minimum wage in 2016 could only cover 68.2% of the cost, and would graduate with almost $20,000 in student debt. And these numbers are for a relatively affordable school. What happens when we pick a more expensive school? Let's look at Samford University, a little private school in Birmingham, Alabama. In 1987, a 4-year degree from Samford cost $56,519. A student making minimum wage in 1987 would only be able to cover 62.4% of the total cost, and would graduate with $21,280 in student debt. Fast forward to 2016, and the price of a 4-year degree from Samford had jumped to $160,660. That's an increase of 184%. A student working part-time in 2016 could only cover 26.3% of the cost of their education, leaving them with $118,436 in student debt. Now, in this case, both students graduate with loans to pay off. Let's do the math on those. The average salary for an early career college-educated worker was $49,406 in 1987 and $50,556 in 2016. Side note, I and all of my friends would have loved to find a $50,000 job right out of school, but I digress. Let's assume both students set aside 10% of their salary each year to pay towards their debt, and their salary increases by 3% annually. The student in 1987 would be able to pay off their loans in 5 years, 3 months. The student in 2016 will likely never be able to pay off their loan unless their salary increases dramatically, because the interest owed would outpace monthly payments. The disparity is even more dramatic if we go back further. In 1968, the minimum wage was $1.60. Adjusted for inflation, that's $11.76. The bottom line is that while costs of everything from education to housing to groceries and prescription drugs have all skyrocketed, the wages of workers have remained the same or gotten worse. Today, the younger generations live lives defined by precarity. Millennials graduated from school with mountains of debt, entered a workforce that wasn't hiring or wasn't offering full-time or benefits. Many jumped on new solutions like gig economy jobs, driving for Uber or Lyft, delivering for any number of delivery companies, or turning to freelance work to pay the bills and hoping for a steady job to become available. That 9-to-5 job that our parents hated has become a dream for many young workers, and one that seems increasingly unattainable as businesses outsource to increase profits and keep workers just under full-time so they don't have to provide benefits like health insurance. These factors have combined to create an entire generation of young people who live paycheck to paycheck and are routinely mocked by older folks who don't realize just how much has changed over the last few decades. Nor do they seem to realize that the oldest millennials are now 40 years old, and we're about to see a whole new generation enter this rigged economy. The defining moments of the average millennial's life have been 9/11, the financial crash of 2008, and now the coronavirus economic crisis. We've seen none of the promised land that our parents remember, and yet people always say the economy is doing great, and we see those at the very top add billions to their net worth every year. And now, with the world's largest and wealthiest superpower on the brink of collapse, it's unsurprising that people are beginning to ask why this is happening. Let's return to the concept of class struggle. There are two overarching classes in any given society: the owner class, or capital, and the working class, or labor. Workers sell their labor and their time to owners for a wage. Owners do not work for a wage. Instead, they own the means by which capital, money, is produced. That could be a factory or a skyscraper or a hotel, things that need workers to operate. In a nutshell, your goal as a worker and your boss's goal as an owner are diametrically opposed. You want to spend as little time working for the greatest wage possible, so you have time to enjoy the fruits of your labor with your friends and family. Your boss wants to get as much work out of you for as little money as possible to maximize profits. These goals are in conflict. This is the nature of class struggle. The notion of the middle class is largely a construct to divide the working population. If you work for a wage, that is, if you sell your time and labor to someone else, whether you make $15,000 per year or $150,000 per year, you are working class. This will be important later. But for now, let's turn to some things I think everyone can agree upon. If you asked me to sum up the American dream, it would look something like this. 3 core tenets. If you work 40 hours per week in America, you should be able to afford a home in the city in which you work, the essentials of everyday life, and be able to put a little bit away in savings. 1 full-time job should be enough. Second, if you live in America, you should not go bankrupt paying a medical bill. All Americans should be able to see a doctor when they need to. Finally, everyone should pay their fair share in taxes. Corporations should not be able to dodge taxes, nor should they be able to buy politicians. I think everyone can get behind these 3 basic human ideals. Just common sense and decency. Modern-day American capitalism is no longer compatible with these ideals. If you don't believe me, let's look at what rampant late-stage capitalism has created. According to the Federal Reserve's report on the economic well-being of U.S. households in 2017, 40% of Americans can't afford a surprise $400 expense, which is a challenge in a pandemic because an ambulance ride in America will cost you more than twice that amount, not to mention the treatment. The federal minimum wage hasn't been adjusted for inflation in over 10 years. America is the only first-world country not to guarantee paid parental leave. Life-saving drugs in America often cost 10 times what they cost in other countries. For example, in Canada, 1 vial of insulin costs $32. In the United States, the same drug from the same factory costs $300. And that's not even an extreme example. Take the HIV drug Truvada. In Australia, it costs just $8. In the United States, it costs $2,000, despite US taxpayers footing the bill for its development. It was estimated that 500,000 people will go bankrupt from medical expenses this year. That was before the coronavirus epidemic. Now we have no idea, and most people don't even want to think about it. Wealth inequality is at its worst point in 100 years, with the top 0.1% owning the same amount of wealth as the bottom 90%. In 2018, for the first time in history, the richest 400 families paid a lower tax rate than the bottom 50%. So, Mike Bloomberg, the guy who just spent $1 billion on a disastrous bid for the Democratic nomination, paid a lower tax rate than his secretary. For those of you thinking, so what? A smaller percent of a bigger number is still more money. Say you've got $100 and I've got $1 million. I've got all my needs covered easily. So taking, say, 20% wouldn't make a difference to me. 20% of your $100 could be the difference between covering groceries and bills or not. And while individual greed is reprehensible, what we see from corporations is even worse. In 2018, Amazon paid $0 in federal taxes on $11.2 billion in profit. That is obscene. So, what are those in power doing to fix these problems?
As Congress is dealing with the brutal economic fallout from the crisis, reports that at least 2 senators sold off stocks after receiving official coronavirus briefings before the markets tanked.
There's a massive economic stimulus package that's being crafted. This is a part of it. It could also include roughly $50 billion in assistance for airlines.
What Mitch McConnell and the Republicans in the Senate just presented was just a package of corporate sweeteners to hand a blank check to Trump and Mnuchin that is secret, that we won't even know who they're doling money out to. And then they're just slapping the name coronavirus on top of it. But if you're going to pass an eviction, a mortgage moratorium, without also passing a rent moratorium, what you are doing is that you are providing relief to people, largely, at least in the city of New York, based on their class, and that you're providing higher relief to people who are landowners or landlords.
Now, stocks did very briefly move off their lows today when the Federal Reserve announced it would pump $1 trillion of liquidity into the market to try to calm the market. But by the looks of things, and with the Dow down over 2,000 points today, it looks like that didn't work.
You won't be surprised to learn that the powerful are doing what they always do, trying their best to keep it. The rest of us be damned. They're considering bailouts for industries like the airlines, who spent 96% of the past decade's cash flow on buybacks. If you don't understand what stock buybacks are, here's a quick rundown. When a company has cash on hand, they often buy back their own shares from shareholders and take them off the market. This makes the remaining shares appear more valuable. This practice disproportionately benefits executives, whose compensation comes largely in the form of stock options as opposed to a traditional salary. That's why when you see a CEO like Dave Calhoun of Boeing declare that he won't be taking a salary this year, you should look more closely. Most executive compensation comes from stock options and other bonuses. When Goldman Sachs was bailed out, they awarded their executives record bonuses. Foregoing a salary is just a show to appear magnanimous. If Boeing gets a bailout, they will do the same thing every other major corporation does. They will buy back stocks and pad the bank accounts of their executives at the expense of taxpayers. That's our money, and we will not see any benefit or gratitude from them. Remember, they spent 96% of the past decade's cash flow on buybacks. They'll do it again. Boeing is currently asking for $60 billion in federal assistance. But wait a minute, where was their emergency fund? Maybe they should cut out their daily Starbucks and avocado toast if they want to save money. See what I did there? The workers are expected to have 3 months of expenses saved up or risk being lectured by the rich on financial responsibility. But a couple of weeks of bad business and now giant corporations led by multimillionaires are crying for help. It's not just the airlines either. All of the major cruise lines are calling for bailouts too. But the thing about getting help from the US government is that you really should operate as a US business. But many cruise lines operate under foreign flags to dodge US taxes. These include Disney, registered in the Bahamas, Celebrity in Malta, and Carnival in Panama. The absolute nerve of these companies, whose CEOs haul in millions of dollars in profits, in no small part because of their tax evasion, in asking the American people to bail them out. But here we get to an interesting idea. If the cruise lines and the airlines, two major contributors to climate change, are on the brink of collapse, maybe we should let them fail. Or if we do decide to save them, they need to give up the keys, nationalize the industries that refuse to use their money responsibly. We've been told time and time again that we don't have the money to transition to a green economy, and yet we're inevitably going to spend billions bailing out some of the worst offenders in the climate crisis. We have an opportunity to stop this. But if we're being honest, we should at least expect to see the government cave and bail out the airlines. Watch what happens. Their executives will make a lot of money. But on the topic of huge sums of money, let's talk about the attempt to save a spiraling stock market. The Fed pumped $1.5 trillion in short-term loans into the stock market, hoping to stop the bleeding and keep investors from losing their minds. $1.5 trillion, and no one batted an eye. This is particularly egregious when you realize that the richest 10% of people own 90% of all stocks. Funny to think that anytime a proposal to help the majority comes along, say universal healthcare or student loan forgiveness, there's a whole lot of pearl clutching and shouting about how we can't afford it, despite the mountains of evidence that show these programs would benefit the economy. But when the wealthy and powerful want something, sure, what the hell, here's $1.5 trillion that might temporarily stop the sell-off. And guess what? It's not working. Why? Because the wealthy people who own the companies don't create value. Their workers do. When there's no labor keeping the companies running, everything falls apart. But while we're on the topic of the stock market, let's talk about insider trading.
That day, he dumped up to $1.7 million in stocks in 33 separate transactions. Burr bought nothing that day. It was a flurry of selling. On January 24th, he attended a closed-door briefing on the Chinese coronavirus. It was delivered by Dr. Anthony Fauci and the head of the CDC. Apparently, what Burr heard there spooked him. Burr hid what he knew about the coronavirus threat and then lied about it at length to the nation. For a public servant, it's pretty hard to imagine many things more immoral than doing this. Richard Burr had critical information that might have helped the people he is sworn to protect, but he hid that information and helped only himself. Instead of sounding the alarm, alerting the country, goading the government into action, as an ethical person would have done, Burr told easy lies that in the end may have killed people.
You know you've done something appalling when Tucker Carlson turns on you. What Loeffler and Burr did is truly nauseating. They withheld information about the severity of the coming crisis, and they profited from it. These people have blood on their hands. But the thing is, they're just playing the game of capitalism. They saw an opportunity to make money, and they took it. But as I'm writing the script for this video, on Tuesday, March 24th, we're beginning to see something even more sadistic.
We have to get back to work. Our people want to work. They want to go back. They have to go back.
Let's get back to work. Let's get back to living. Let's be smart about it. And those of us who are 70 plus, we'll take care of ourselves, but don't sacrifice the country. Don't do that. Don't ruin this great American dream.
So you're basically saying that this disease could take your life, but that's not the scariest thing to you. There's something that would be worse than dying.
Yeah.
is the cure worse than the disease? Because you're talking about shutting down the world economy.
We cannot let the cure be worse than the problem itself. We're not going to let the cure be worse than the problem.
Really, it was inevitable that we'd reach this point. As our economy tanks because we botched the response to the coronavirus, the ultra-wealthy would need to find a way to fix it. Their solution? Human sacrifice. Look at this chart. We have the worst trajectory line. We've been hearing a lot of talk about flattening the curve, referring to keeping the number of cases below the capacity for the healthcare system. But if the owner class decides to tell everybody to go back to work, guess what's going to happen? We're not going to flatten the curve, we're going to kill hundreds of thousands or millions of people. The act of going on TV and suggesting that grandparents should be willing to die for the sake of the economy and their grandchildren is pure evil, plain and simple. Let's look at the two options we have. Option 1. Follow the lead of other, more ethical nations and do everything in our power to flatten the curve, keep our people safe, and cover their expenses for the duration of the crisis. Or Option 2. Condemn millions to die because some billionaire assholes can't stand to lose a few dollars. One option is morally right, and the other is capitalism. Guess which one will win? By the time this video is uploaded, I bet we'll have our answer. In the midst of all this talk about hard truths and sacrifice and greater good, there's one group of people who are revealing themselves to be absolute parasites.
So if you own 20, 30 rental houses and a lot of those people start losing their jobs, what do you think that's going to do to you? They're not going to be able to make the payment, which means you're going to have to make it as you have an extra expense evicting them, and you're going to have more vacancy loss, more expenses, more repair costs, trying to fix the property back up to get it nice to rent out again.
Let's get one thing straight. Being a landlord is not a job. The number of entitled landlords taking to Twitter to rant is staggering, saying things like, "It is a job, I have to install lights," or "I have to decorate the place." That's not a job. That's part of being a homeowner, and no one forced you to buy additional homes. When the first of the month rolls around and these vipers start demanding rent that people can no longer pay because their jobs are shut down, what happens? Mass evictions in the middle of a global pandemic? Don't think for a second most landlords will be lenient. They've already shown that they don't care. When they say to you, "Tough luck, I have a mortgage to pay," what they're really saying is, "You have a mortgage to pay for me." Being a landlord is not a job. These people buy up all the properties and hold them hostage. They are part of the problem. Finally, let's talk about the myth of the philanthropic billionaire. We've all heard the ultra-wealthy say things like, "We shouldn't be taxed because billions of dollars in the hands of a good person is more useful to society than in the hands of the government." You should have been skeptical of this claim in the first place, but the pandemic has made it abundantly clear that there's no such thing as a good billionaire. Look at some of the largest corporations: McDonald's, Amazon, Walmart. These companies make billions in profits, and yet their workers are some of the worst compensated. And even in the face of a deadly disease, they're expected to come into work, and they're not guaranteed paid sick leave. Some companies even have the nerve to ask employees to donate their sick days to affected co-workers, instead of just giving everyone guaranteed leave. But finally, we're seeing normal people begin to fight back. On March 23rd, Amazon gave in to pressure from a small crew of workers at DCH1 in Chicago. They had been inspired by Sacramento Amazon workers starting a petition to demand paid time off, walking off the job, and demanding a meeting with the regional manager. And so they did the same thing. They organized their co-workers, and 3 crews from 3 different shifts handed in copies of the petition to the boss at company meetings. And you know what happened? They won. They took on the richest man on the planet, and they won. All Amazon employees are now entitled to paid time off. That's what happens when the workers realize that they have real power when they work together. We're beginning to see similar actions from sanitation workers, with Pittsburgh garbage collectors refusing to pick up trash without getting adequate protection and hazard pay. We're seeing renters who won't be able to pay their bills on the first of the month stand up to merciless landlords. Renters are hanging white sheets outside their windows as a sign of solidarity with the millions of others pressing for a national rent strike. These are good things. We need more of them. So let's recap the current state of affairs. We're projected to experience the worst unemployment in US history in the middle of a global pandemic, yet our ability to see a doctor is tied to our employment. Those in power are bickering over relief legislation while we're just days away from millions being unable to afford their rent payments. Opportunists like Senator Loeffler are posting pictures of them working hard when they've just been caught insider trading and literally profiting off the death of their fellow Americans. We've seen billionaires and the world's wealthiest corporations try to save a few bucks by refusing to take care of their employees, despite the rich always saying the money does more good in the hands of philanthropic billionaires. That is obviously a lie. They hoard their wealth and leave millions to die. The government dumped $1.5 trillion into the stock market like it was nothing. Remember that the next time they say something is too expensive. They're lying. At least this pandemic has made some things abundantly clear. When your boss said your job couldn't be done from home, they were lying. When universities said a class couldn't be taught online, they were lying. When those in power say universal healthcare is too expensive, they're lying. Every time they say a beneficial program is too expensive, they're lying. That forgiving student loan debt is impossible, that raising wages is too difficult, that affordable housing is unreasonable. All lies. Those at the levers of power always use that power to keep it. They will never give up any of that power without a struggle, as we saw with Amazon. So what can we do? If power is so entrenched in the hands of the few, what can normal people do? The pandemic has made one more thing clear. The economy doesn't function without workers. It falls apart in a week without the cashiers, stockers, drivers, and countless others rich people love to deride as lazy. The pandemic has proven that it's the workers who create value, not the owners who do nothing. There is power in labor. If the millions at the bottom stand up and say, "Enough is enough, you work for us now," we'll see some real changes. Unite in solidarity with your fellow workers and press your demands. Capitalism is the root of all of today's evils. It cannot solve the problems it creates. Those in power will listen to the rest of us if we can organize and really pressure them to enact our demands. Whether you make $15,000 a year or $150,000, if you sell your labor and hours of your life for a wage, you are working class. That should be a mark of pride, because it's the working class that keeps this country running. The parasites at the very top don't care if you die. They would rather kill millions of Americans than lose a single % of their wealth. It's time to remember the language of class struggle and fight for dignity and a livable future. If you'd like to learn more about any of the topics discussed in this video, I've left links in the description. Take the time to educate yourself about the things that matter. We have a future to win, and we need everybody to do their part. Thank you for watching.